Alright, training camp is just around the corner. So let's take a look at how things stand with the Arizona Cardinals roster. In this video, I'm going to take a deeper dive looking into each position group on the Arizona Cardinals preseason roster to identify some key position battles, look at some of the places where the Cardinals are probably going to have to make some tough decisions, and try to get a sense for who's likely to actually make this roster. Now, the first thing I did to prepare for this was I looked at the Week 1 roster breakdown for the Arizona Cardinals over the past 2 seasons under Coach Cliff Kingsbury. And as we take a close look at each position group, I'm going to reference these numbers as a starting point for determining how many players the Cardinals are likely to keep at each position. First up is quarterback. I think the only real question at quarterback is whether they're going to go with 2 or 3 of them on the roster. The Cardinals originally envisioned Chris Streveler as sort of a Taysom Hill type player, but the coaching staff has not been successful in using him in the same kind of creative ways that New Orleans has used Taysom Hill. And when called upon to play quarterback late last season, Streveler really struggled. In response to Streveler's struggles, the Cardinals went out and signed veteran quarterback Colt McCoy. McCoy has been a solid backup throughout his career, and even has experience starting at the NFL level. And really, he's an ideal veteran backup who can step in and play when needed. I expect that Colt McCoy is going to be the backup quarterback, and the Cardinals are going to have to make a tough decision about whether they're going to keep Streveler on the roster and to continue to try to develop him. And as we'll see in some of the later positions, the numbers game is going to make it really difficult to justify keeping a third quarterback this season. Now, the next position we're going to look at is running backs. Over the past 2 seasons, the Cardinals have kept 3 running backs on the roster, and I would expect that they're going to do the same thing this year. There's really no question as to who the top 2 running backs are on this roster. It's going to be Chase Edmonds and James Conner. Now, there is some question about how the work will be divided up between these two, but that's a conversation for another time. The bigger question for our purposes today is who's going to be that third running back. Eno Benjamin probably has the best chance of earning that third spot, but don't be surprised if there is a legitimate competition amongst him and the other backs on the roster. But when all is said and done, I do think Benjamin will probably earn that spot. Next up is wide receiver. Now, at the time I'm recording this, there still isn't any word on whether Larry Fitzgerald is going to come back for another season. And if Fitz were to come back, that certainly changes the equation here. But as it stands, the top 4 receiver positions on this roster are pretty well set. DeAndre Hopkins, AJ Green, Christian Kirk, and Rondale Moore are all pretty much locks for this roster. Andy Isabella and Keyshawn Johnson are also likely to make the team. I don't really expect any of the other receivers currently on the roster to make the squad. It is possible if one of them stands out on special teams, they could potentially earn a spot, but with some of the tough decisions that are going to have to be made across this roster, I don't see the Cardinals keeping more than 6 receivers going into week 1. The next position we're going to look at is one that feels really unsettled on this roster, and that's tight end. Now, Max Williams is pretty well set as the starting tight end at this point, and he's been an outstanding blocking tight end during his time with the Cardinals. But after losing Dan Arnold in free agency, the Cardinals appear to lack a legitimate receiving threat at the tight end position. Darrell Daniels will probably be back on the roster this season, but with the lack of NFL experience among the rest of the players on the roster at this position, there's a legitimate question as to whether they're going to keep 2 or 3 tight ends. If they do decide to keep 3 tight ends, there's a real possibility that third tight end is going to be someone who's not yet on the roster. But it could be a legitimate competition amongst the players they currently have. One name to keep an eye on among this group is Kerry Angeline. Angeline doesn't necessarily possess some of the high-end athletic traits for the position, but he showed solid receiving skills at the collegiate level. I could see him making this roster with the Cardinals hoping he could develop into the next Dan Arnold. Next up is offensive line. In 2019, the Cardinals kept 11 offensive linemen on their Week 1 roster, and last season they kept 10. Now again, with all of the positions where they're going to have to make tough decisions, I think they're going to go with 10 offensive linemen this season. DJ Humphries, Kelvin Beachum, Rodney Hudson, Justin Pugh, and Josh Jones are all locks to make this roster in my opinion. I also think that Justin Murray and Brian Winters are pretty safe on this roster. Max Garcia, Michael Manet, and Joshua Miles are the most likely candidates for the last 3 spots, though it is possible that one of the other offensive linemen like Sean Harlow, Deion Calhoun, Brandon Bowen, or Coda Martin could earn one of those spots. But I think Garcia, Manet, and Miles are most likely going to round out this squad. Now, all the starters on the offensive line are pretty well set at this point with the exception of right guard. That appears to be a competition between Brian Winters, Justin Murray, and Josh Jones, last year's 3rd round pick. Now, Jones played tackle in college, so he would be making a position change if he earns that starting job. I still think Jones is going to end up being a tackle at some point, and I could see him being the next right tackle when Kelvin Beachum moves on. But at this point, it really does seem to be a true competition between these 3 for that right guard position. Now let's shift our attention to the defensive side of the ball, starting with the defensive line. For the purposes of this discussion, we're talking about interior defensive linemen, nose tackles, and 3-4 defensive ends. Edge rushers like Chandler Jones in this 3-4 defense are considered outside linebackers. Now, a player like J.J. Watt is going to move up and down the line and will sometimes potentially play at outside linebacker, but we're going to consider him a defensive lineman for this conversation. The Cardinals kept 6 players in this position group last year and 7 the year before. J.J. Watt is obviously a lock at this position, and I think Zach Allen, Jordan Phillips, Rashad Lawrence, and Leki Fotu are very likely to make this squad. Now that leaves probably 1 to 2 spots for the remaining players on the roster. Now while the Cardinals are considered a 3-4 defense, like most teams in the league, they play a lot in the nickel, so that nose tackle position isn't necessarily on the field a whole lot. J.J. Watt and Zach Allen are likely to play defensive end. Jordan Phillips will probably also play at defensive end. And Rashard Lawrence will probably play nose tackle some and rotate some into that defensive end position. Leki Fotu is probably also going to play 3-4 defensive end. And one of the remaining spots in this position group is likely to go to someone who can play nose tackle for them. David Perry is a former 5th round pick who has starting experience at nose tackle, but he's been out of the league for a few years due to some personal issues. It wouldn't surprise me if he earns one of those remaining spots and potentially even plays a good bit at nose tackle. Xavier Williams is also a possibility. Now, if the Cardinals do go with 7 players at this position, in addition to whichever nose tackle makes the squad between Perry and Xavier Williams, I could see Michael Dogby coming back for another season. But really, once you get past the first 5, there's a lot of question marks as to who's going to round out this group. Now, defensive line is one of those positions where teams like to rotate players in and out. So most of the players who make the roster are probably going to see some snaps. But I would expect J.J. Watt to be one of the starters, obviously. And I think Zach Allen and Jordan Phillips are going to be competing for who's going to be that other starting defensive end. If David Perry makes the roster, I could see him competing with Rashard Lawrence for the starting nose tackle position. But regardless of who earns a starting job, you're probably going to see a good 4 to 5 players rotated in on a regular basis. Now, the next defensive position we're going to look at is linebacker. This includes both pass rushing outside linebackers like Chandler Jones and middle linebackers like Zaven Collins and Isaiah Simmons. The Cardinals kept 9 players at this position in 2019 and 10 last season. Chandler Jones, Zaven Collins, and Isaiah Simmons are locks to make the roster, and I think Marcus Golden is pretty close to a lock. But once we get past those 4, things get a little bit tricky. Steve Keim raised some eyebrows when he anointed Zaven Collins the starter, ahead of veteran Jordan Hicks. It was also reported that Hicks was given permission to seek a trade. And while nothing has occurred on that front thus far, I could see the Cardinals cutting Hicks to give him a chance to try to pursue a starting job somewhere else. But if he's willing to take that backup role and doesn't push to be released, I think he's going to make the roster. Devin Kennard is probably also safe, though he did have a disappointing season last year after signing as a free agent with the Cardinals. Now, the only question with Dennis Gardeck is he going to be healthy in time for the start of the season? If he is healthy and good to go, I think he's a pretty safe bet to make the roster. I also think Victor Dimukeje is going to make this roster. Even if he struggles, I don't think the Cardinals are going to risk trying to get him onto the practice squad and hoping that he isn't poached by another team. Tanner Vallejo has a pretty decent shot at making this roster as a middle linebacker, and I would consider Vallejo a lock if Jordan Hicks ends up moving on. But if Hicks ends up staying with the Cardinals and Gardeck is ready to go in week 1, that already brings us to 9 players. Now, the Cardinals do really like Ezekiel Turner as a special teams contributor, and if they're only keeping one more linebacker, he's probably it. But again, if Hicks moves on and Gardeck isn't ready to go on week 1, we could see a couple more names from this list make the roster. Now, as far as starting jobs go, Collins and Simmons seem to be locked in at the middle linebacker positions, and obviously Chandler Jones is going to be one of the starters at outside linebacker. I would expect Marcus Golden to be the other starting outside linebacker, but we'll probably see some other players rotate in like Kennard and Dumakaji. Next, we move on to cornerback, a position where the Cardinals may have some tough choices to make. Over the last 2 seasons, the Cardinals have only kept 4 players at this position. And as you'll see in a moment, I think there's a reasonable chance they're going to end up keeping more than 4 this year. Malcolm Butler and Byron Murphy Jr. are locks on this roster, and I think Marco Wilson is also going to be safe. The biggest question with Robert Alford is health. Now, if he is healthy, I think there's a good chance he ends up making this roster. But it's not outside of the realm of possibility that Alford could struggle to earn a spot on this roster after missing the last 2 seasons due to injury. Now, it's hard to know if Darqueze Dennard was signed as insurance in case Alford doesn't end up working out, or if they really do intend to keep him on the roster either way. I tend to lean towards the latter, due to his familiarity with Vance Joseph, and the fact that I think he's generally a good player. The toughest decision for this position group, though, could be Tay Gowan. Gowan was selected in the 6th round, though many had projected him to go much earlier than that in the draft. If the Cardinals were to cut Gowan in the hopes of getting him onto the practice squad, there's a high likelihood another team's going to end up signing him. So there's a scenario where the Cardinals are looking at potentially keeping 6 cornerbacks on this roster. And because rosters are a zero-sum game, you can only have 53 players. 2 more players at the cornerback position, as compared to what they've kept in the past, are 2 players they can't keep at other positions. When it's all said and done, I do think they're probably going to end up with 5 cornerbacks on the roster, but they are going to end up having to make a tough decision somewhere to get there. Now, as far as the starters go, that's a whole other question. Butler is going to be a starter on the outside. Many thought Byron Murphy would be a starter at the slot position, but there's been some talk of him as their number 1 outside cornerback. Whether he's playing in the slot or on the outside, Murphy's likely to be on the field an awful lot. But that other starting position could end up being Robert Alford if he's healthy, or Darqueze Dennard if he's not, and there's even the possibility that Marco Wilson earns that position. But the odds are that it's going to be Butler, Murphy, and Alford as the 3 starting cornerbacks. Next, we get to safety, another position where the Cardinals are going to have a lot of good players vying for a limited number of roster spots. The Cardinals have kept 5 players at this position over the last 2 seasons, but if they end up keeping 5 or even 6 cornerbacks, it's not inconceivable that they would keep only 4 safeties. Budda Baker's a lock to make this roster, and I think Jalen Thompson is as well. But the next 2 or 3 players at this position are really hard to identify. The Cardinals signed Sean Williams as a free agent this offseason, and he's been a good player for the Bengals over the years. Of the players not named Budda Baker and Jalen Thompson, I think he's probably the safest bet to make the roster. Deontay Thompson's played a number of snaps for the Cardinals, but I wouldn't say that he set himself apart from the other players on this list. Chris Banjo is a veteran who's played reasonably well at points, and James Wiggins is a rookie who is supposed to be a stud on special teams. In fact, that may be one of the things that helps him to get an edge in this competition. Charles Washington's another veteran, and I think he's probably the least likely of the players on this list to make the roster. But if I had to pick 5 players that I think are going to make this roster at the safety position, I'd go with Budda Baker, Jalen Thompson, Sean Williams, Chris Banjo, and James Wiggins. But make no mistake, this is going to be one of the toughest competitions on the roster, and every single one of the players on this list has a legitimate shot to make the cut. And finally, we get to special teams. This is probably the most straightforward position group we've looked at. The Cardinals signed Matt Prater to be their kicker after a rough season with Zane Gonzalez in 2020. Andy Lee is continuing as the punter, and Aaron Brewer is back as the long snapper. They do have punter Tyler Newsome on the roster, and he has turned some heads with his hang time on his kicks. But the odds are it's going to be Prater, Lee, and Brewer for this position group. So now that we've looked at each position group individually, let's take a quick look at the entire roster and identify the players that I think are locks, safe bets to make the roster, those who are competing for spots, and those who I think are not likely to have a shot at making the roster. Now here we see the list of all the players that are currently on the roster at the time I'm doing this recording, separated into the position groups we just looked at. The names in blue are those players that I think are locks to make the roster. The players in green are the players that I think are safe bets to make the roster. The players in yellow are those who I think are in a legitimate competition for a spot on this roster. Finally, the names in orange are those who I don't think are really going to end up competing for a spot on this roster. It's possible one or more of them makes the team, but all these players have really long odds of making the Cardinals roster this year. They're more likely to be candidates for the practice squad. So what do you think of the Cardinals roster going into the preseason? Are there any players that you think are going to surprise people and make the roster? Or do you see any surprise cuts coming? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And while you're there, please be sure to click like and subscribe to my channel for more Arizona Cardinals content. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on The Cardinal Rule.